digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined by a whole host of wonderful games industry and VR industry folks. We have the lovely Phil back from Big Points. We have Debs joining us once again from Space Ape. We have Micah, who's going to explain all about the many things he does. And also Rick, who's going to explain about all of the wonderful stuff that he does. So I'm going to start with you, Rick. Do you want to explain a little bit about what you've been doing in the VR industry?
Yep, I'm a creative technologist, so I cover all sorts of territories of technology, but VR being a significant part of that repertoire of technologies at my disposal. I come from an advertising background. I worked for Jaguar Land Rover and several other brands over the years, doing various VR and experiential works.
Wonderful, thank you. And Micah, why don't you explain a little bit more about what you do and all of the people that you represent on Facebook?
Sure. I'm a researcher. I research neuroscience and computational neuroscience and machine learning. And so I do that I share my research in 30 different science and technology groups. And those groups now represent over 200,000 members that participate. Those groups are VR groups and brain-computer interface groups. And, some of the big ones are just general science and technology groups. And then also, in addition to that, I organize events. So I have a Neurotech SF workshop event where we're actually creating new brain-computer interfaces that connect things like EEG and ECG with VR headsets and artificial intelligence technology. And I also organize San Francisco virtual reality events. So we have speakers come and VR demos, and so we'll have neuroscientists come and talk. And then I organize events, and I have these big giant Facebook groups, and I also have Silicon Valley Global News. So I actually go to big events throughout the year and cover the latest science and technology. So coming up, there's I don't know if I should go over the other events, but coming up there's some big events, and I'll go and meet with the scientists who are presenting their latest technology. It's technology event and cover it for the news. And that's my I do that at Silicon Valley Global News. And then also I do designing new brain computer interfaces, and also artificial cortex is one of the plans, and artificial brains. And one of the programs. So I do a podcast called the Neuralace Podcast, and also a show called Death Star Robot Talk Show, and also the Nerve Gear Show, and a new one called Neurohackster. So
that's quite a lot of things that you're doing at the moment.
Yes, it is a ton of things, but it all boils down to bringing people together to talk about science and technology in a variety of different mediums. So one is podcasts, one is events, one is workshops, one is in online Facebook groups, and all of it boils down to just meeting with people to talk about science and technology in some ways.
Awesome.
And yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Debs, why don't you tell us more about what you're doing at Space Ape? Because I know that you also wear very many hats, young lady.
Hello. Yeah, sure. So I am basically head of content at Space Ape, which means that I create a lot of content, a lot of video content, do a lot of video production, whether that's for our community of players. I do quite a lot of community management as well, or running our live streams, or whether it's to do with marketing material or general videos about our company or our public image. I do things like that as well. I also run events for the company, whether it's for the London Games Festival or esports events or what have you. And right now, most of my time is consumed with an educational program that we've just kicked off called Space Ape Varsity, where we basically go talk at partner universities about different disciplines within game design, game development.
Wonderful. And for those who are not based within the UK, who may not know a huge amount about Space Ape, would you care to explain who your key partner or key investors are?
So we've been around for about 6 years. We've got 4 live titles, and last year we partnered with Supercell, makers of Clash Royale, Clash of Clans. I'm sure you guys are all aware of them. So yeah, that's been a great boost for us and a great partnership for our future. So we're so far we've delved into the build and battle genres, but we are currently exploring different genres. About 70% of our resources actually go towards making new titles and developing new games at the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Phil, why don't you tell us all about what you're up to with Big Point?
Hi, I'm Phil Harris. I make the tea. No, actually, I'm senior narrative designer at BigPoint. I involve myself with more than, 3 or 4 different products, including ones owned by our owning company, Yuzu, who are across in China. 2 of them are very, very old intellectual properties. In one of them, where I've been doing a lot of writing, we've seen an 8% rise, which is really, really good across community and across the board. For an 11-year-old game, that's pretty unheard of, and it's a credit to all the team there. But I also do a series of podcasts and other casts for BigPoint. I also teach design and narrative design at numerous occasions. I'll be at the Moray Game Jam next weekend, which is up in the north of Scotland and is absolutely fabulous. And I'll be teaching there about going from basic concept to actually creating a game design document. So I do a lot of things as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And of course, you are also an alumni of the VR Writers' Room as well.
I am an alumni of the VR Writers' Room and very, very pleased to be so as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And one of the things that I feel is now becoming quite apparent now that we know who's in this particular conversation is that there is a commonality of theme here, and it focuses very much around the games communities and audiences, if you will, and how these communities and these audiences have evolved over time, but also where it's kind of heading and where we're going with this. And so I want to pick up on a couple of different things that have been mentioned here. First of all, Phil kind of mentioned about a particular game. We're not naming names, by the way, but we are talking about a game that's quite old that, as you say, has had an uplift, which is very unusual for a game of a certain time frame. And I suppose what we should do is give our listeners some context as to why that's so unusual. Because with most gaming products, we see a very specific pattern, which we would normally call the curve bell, where we see this big, hockey stick of acquisition, and then we see that golden arch of monetization, and then we see that sunset curve as the game kind of just gently winds down, and the fans all kind of move on to the next game. And that's something you can't really escape from a commercial perspective for any game title. It's very, very rare to be able to turn that around. And one of the things that I'm quite interested to discuss is the evolution, first of all, of gaming, but also of gaming audiences. Now, I say this on the basis of, recently, there's been a few different news items that have kind of bubbled up to the surface. One has been the fact that the United Nations and the World Health Organization specifically have recently published a report classifying and defining games as an addiction, which is, there's a lot of arguments for and against such a statement. But then we also have things like the American president recently deciding to call a conference to discuss violence in gaming and its impacts on society. And so I feel that there is perhaps a bit of a perception issue around what audiences are getting from the experience when it comes to gaming, but also how those audiences behave, how those communities behave to encourage these types of behaviours. And so I'm going to start out with you, first of all, Debs, because you're dealing with a lot of different communities and you obviously manage communities in your day job. But I'm curious from your perspective, first of all, just what are the trends that you've seen emerging in the last kind of couple of years, where we have begun to see more of an acknowledgement, if you like, from the mainstream establishment that perhaps there are some connections, be they tenuous or not, to negative impacts when it comes to communities in gaming?
I mean, I guess I can speak mostly to our communities, our community of players. And I find it's very game dependent, to be honest. So for one of our titles, our community is just very, very vocal on what they like and what they don't like. And because it's an older game as well, like those elder players are quite established. And so they make up the biggest voice of the game. And like I said, they really know what they like at this point because they've been playing for a long time, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas for some of our newer titles, or for Transformers, for example, which is out for, has it been a year, 2 years now? Man, I'm not even sure. But they're generally like very positive, and they're just so excited about all the new releases and updates and stuff in the game. So I think it really depends on the community or on the game. At least that's what I've noticed.
Phil, what's your take on this, given that you've worked with MMO gaming and also mobile gaming?
Well, personally, my dad used to take me out to like shoot a bow when I was like younger, and that didn't make me go sort of crazy and like run around the streets trying to like pop off people with like a bow. I think the communities are particularly strong. I think communities become dedicated to products, and it's very, very interesting because at this point in time, some parts of the games industry are looking for these sort of ultimate sandbox experiences where you create the experience and then you just build on top of that experience rather than creating something new. And Jim Sterling made a very, very good comment in his article about this, which was quite recent, where he was talking about the fact that what you're doing there is you're actually cutting your nose off to spite your face, because yes, you get a community involved in a product, and this is exactly why we've got strong communities involved in like our products. This is why MMOs don't tend to die, because basically people have invested money and time into the product. They've like built up friendships there, sometimes even got into like relationships and marriage through this type of thing. And it means a whole lot to them. And the people, in the end, the communities actually sort of patrol themselves. They like control themselves. They shut down the people who aren't really part of the community or who are oddities to the community because they don't like them, they don't fit with their like standards. Yes, people drop off, and the people who drop off can become like enemies of that community, but they become an irrelevant voice. I think on Facebook you always see the people who are saying, oh, this game has just become pay to win on a whole bunch of different like forums, but that doesn't mean that they're particularly going to be like violent or aggressive about it, or but I do feel that the comment from like the UN and WHO about gaming being an addiction is true, but there are so many other things that are an addiction out there, and it's putting that into the concept of everything else. I mean, there are problems with obesity around like the first world, and that is, for me, because of like addiction and because of the way that the advertising has made people addicted to these products. So there's more than one factor at play here. And to say that this is an addiction, smoking is an addiction, there are many, many other addictions out there. It's how you play the game, and very much now how social media presents itself and how the community exists and how the community shows itself.
It's interesting that you're talking about this addiction issue, because I do tend to think that there is this ideal of, you know, whether it's with gambling or eating or smoking or whatever the thing is, drinking, you know, there is this idea that you can do these things in moderation and it's not an addiction. And so therefore, to label the entirety of gaming as an addiction is kind of questionable when you think about the fact that it's up to the individual, that it's their choice as to how far they decide to go with this thing. And if they decide to not eat or sleep for 48 hours, that's really their personal choice. That isn't, you know, necessarily the way that every single person is engaging and playing a game. But I'm kind of interested, Micah, from your perspective, when we look at the fundamentals of what kind of Phil was saying there about this idea of addictability within gaming, I think one of the things that we probably have to acknowledge for a lot of people that do work in the games industry, and certainly from a commercial end of the perspective, is that there are a lot of elements of what we do in the games industry that is actually designed to create addictive behaviors. You know, let's be honest. That's a lot of what we're doing, is getting people to come back for more, to keep coming back and having these short play sessions or continue to engage. And I think that there are some interesting aspects about how we are trying to engineer behaviors, and whether or not those things are something that you think are being introduced into the development and the evolution of VR gaming, as for example, just because so many people are coming from the games industry into the VR industry. Are we seeing those bad habits, those practices being shuffled into VR?
Well, okay, so I have a couple of things to say on that topic. One of them specifically, so a lot of the big groups that I manage are VR groups. So I see, you know, one of the largest PlayStation VR groups is a group that I manage. Lots of gamers who are specifically VR gamers come and talk, and in terms of well, first of all, in terms of addiction, people say that sugar, like scientists say that sugar is just as addicting as hard drugs that are regulated by the government, that you cannot have class A drugs. Sugar is one of the most addicting things on the planet, and yet and so is caffeine, and so we have these, but people feel that sugar and caffeine are manageable substances, and they're not. But science, the research will show us it's just as that these normal things that people feel that they can regulate in their lives are actually just as addictive in terms of how you measure them. Now, as far as VR goes, I mean, well, so VR is interesting because there's a couple things I want to say, because one of them is is VR addictive? I would say no, it's not. Right now, you can't really, with Google Cardboard, you can't even use it for more than 2 minutes without getting nausea. With the PlayStation VR, you could try to be in there for 3 hours, 4 hours, but the resolution, you just have to take it off after a while because you start seeing the screen door effect. So the resolution won't let you be in there for too long. It does have a powerful effect on your psyche. You can say that because more of your visual senses are tied into basically brought into the computer. So you're more focused on what's going on, because it is as if you're inside the computer when you're wearing a VR headset. So it can have a lot more influence on your mind. Now, there's a lot of research out there, that says that, what Mr. Trump was saying was actually incorrect. There's research that's been done that has shown that violent gaming does not lead to youngsters becoming more aggressive in the real world. That research has been done, it's been proven, and unfortunately, Mr. Trump doesn't actually follow research or logic or science at all. He just makes stuff up. So going back to VR,
mm-hmm.
One thing that is, when it comes to social networks like Facebook gaming, and all the web gaming and iOS gaming and stuff like that, is with iOS, Facebook, and Twitter and all these social networks, these apps, these web apps, are trying to addict people on purpose. They're trying to get people to scroll longer. Their advertisers, hey, people scroll longer, so they actually do all these studies with all these different groups to see which combination of elements in which order is producing the people staring at their screen and scrolling longer, because if you scroll longer, then you're producing advertisers. So there is a huge incentive for all these web app companies. And that's very interesting, because even though we're talking about social networking apps for the most part, and to a lesser extent social games on social networking apps, that kind of plays into VR eventually, because web VR is where it's kind of going. So you're going to have all these companies like Facebook, all these social networking companies, Instagram, Snapchat. There's hundreds of social networking companies that are going to be making web VR apps, and web XR is a new thing. So you have AR and VR, and maybe you're walking down the street wearing AR glasses, and the idea for this is they want you to wear your glasses as long as possible. So they try to make it as interesting as possible. They try to addict you. They try to keep you in the system as long as possible, so you don't want to take it off. So this is kind of like the industry is kind of set up to going forward in the future to want to addict people and to stay in the system as long as possible. It's just not really possible right now, because devices are still not comfortable to use for a long periods of time yet. But that will change.
Okay. So, Rick, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, from the ex-advertising industry perspective. You are one of the culprits, as such, of creating these campaigns that encourage people to get into the environments. And, I know that Michael was saying that not a lot of people can kind of stay in the VR for long. But I'm very aware that there are already, activities where it's encouraged to keep people in there for quite a long time, because they're going to get reward out of it. And when we look at things like, I know that Sarah Jones from Birmingham University and her colleague Dean from Bandwidth, they were in they were in a VR environment for 48 hours. That was actually a stamina challenge for them. And even so, originally they were just going to do it for 24 hours. But by the time they decided to do it for 24 hours, somebody else had already broken that record. So they're like, oh, okay, we'll have to extend it for 48 hours. And, so we see people already kind of challenging themselves to stay inside these environments for quite a long time. And when we look at things like the ESL and Intel partnership for Echo Arena for the VR esports league, that's really challenging people to stay in these environments for a long period of time, because the average tournament, it lasts for a good few hours. I mean, a VR tournament, I don't know how long the one that they just did in Poland lasted, but an average esports tournament can be anywhere between 10 to 15 hours. As you go through each round, as you go through, every game. And sure, you can take off the headset in between games, but that's still quite a long time to expect people to remain within an environment. And so I think that there perhaps is going to be a trend of trying to encourage people to stay in longer, even if it's not the mainstream, but more the people who are kind of at the front edge of this stuff. And I'm sure that from an advertising perspective, all of the marketing and advertising application I have seen so far, campaigns that I've seen so far that people have put together, really are trying to encourage people to stay longer than 3 minutes. And so I'm curious, Rick, from your perspective, do you think that there should be more of a burden of responsibility? And do you think that maybe the Advertising Standards Authority is perhaps moving a little bit too slowly here?
Yes, I think the challenge we have with VR is like what Michael was saying, that like the immersion times are quite short at the moment, but they will become longer. And obviously the technology and like looking at what's coming in the roadmap for hardware coming out in the next year, like we're certainly moving towards technology that is capable of extending those periods of time. Does the advertising industry have a responsibility? I think the advertising industry has had a responsibility for what we advertise at people forever anyway. Whether we do or not is another question. It's a challenge, and one of the biggest sort of challenges that's coming out at the moment, particularly from the advertising space, is the move away from created content that's gone through the usual sort of traditional creative process, and we're moving much more towards automated systems using a lot of sort of programmatic type and dynamic advertising, which is highly tailored, or can be highly tailored in when the data catches up, and then we get into a whole conversation around big data and surveillance on people's behaviours and stuff, but probably for another day. But like that information feeds what we can now drive in advertising and the style of creative that we're generating, kind of messaging we're putting in front of audiences. And obviously, as Michael was saying, in channels like social channels, obviously advertising revenue is critical to like the success of those channels from a commercial perspective. So are we going to end up in a situation where it becomes a free for all, or very, very manipulative, when you've got AIs driving the advertising and not human beings at the other end of it? Slightly fearful of that, it has to be said, not just from a jobs perspective, but I think there is a real risk that once we hand over the reins of control to AIs to do a lot of this decision making, that things could get very interesting. And I think the really interesting space at the moment, the one that hasn't really been particularly contaminated in a way by advertising, is VR channels themselves. At the moment, there isn't a lot of in-game advertising within VR. There isn't a lot of VR-based communities. Obviously we are going to start seeing a trend and a blurring of the boundaries, where we're starting to see game and community, the boundaries of those starting to blur when you have such an immersive environment, that why would you want people to disengage to it and go to an alternative channel by going into, say, Facebook or going into another social channel to go and have that engagement with other people? You would have that engagement within areas within the game space. So that community game boundary starts to blur. But when that happens, then obviously that becomes an incredibly attractive space for advertisers to move into. And then we end up in a situation where we've got very, very high levels of immersion and a high level of engagement, potentially, that you can have in that space. I think it's going to be a really interesting space to see how that develops. I would see even more interesting how regulation develops to control that space. And I think it's going to be one of those spaces that they're going to really struggle with figuring out how to control, because traditional media channels, it's relatively easy to, if you want to, go and control those spaces. But I think VR is going to be a much bigger challenge from that side of things.
It's interesting that you say this, because one of the things that I am mildly concerned about here is the fact that, as you say, at the moment, it's still a little bit too early for real advertising money to want to get into VR, because, they don't see that there's necessarily enough there for them to want to kind of really get into that space. But when they begin to see that there are large audiences who are, as you say, very engaged, because they are very immersed and they're engaging for longer periods of time, that we're going to begin to see this kind of, behavior where they are trying to push a lot of different forms of advertising into these immersive spaces. And I begin to kind of get a little bit cautious here when we think about the fact that when we create a VR experience, there's a reason that people picked up that phrase experience, because we're creating new memories. We are in many ways brain hacking people's memories to insert something new into their mind. And on that basis, when one is, thrust a soda brand constantly inside an immersive environment, is there something to suggest that this is less now advertising and more actually brainwashing? And should there therefore be a completely different stance on this, a different perspective on this that perhaps hasn't been considered? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think, obviously sort of what we're seeing now is, there's certainly technology around now that can retrospectively insert advertising into pre-created media like film. So you could change the billboard in a film to reflect a brand and things like that. Now that's obviously quite tricky because we're taking real world footage that obviously has all the little nuances of lighting and all of these sort of challenges that make it quite hard to convincingly insert media assets into that space. But the technology's there. The technology is already there that's capable of doing it and doing it very well. We haven't seen a lot of it being pervasively moving into that space yet, but I suspect we probably will soon. But when it comes to games, we have a pure digital asset. So it's completely we can completely manipulate that to our heart's content. So inserting, the classic product placement, as you were sort of alluding to there, it's super easy. You can change the drinks, in the game to whatever brand you like, and you could change it on an individual basis. So you can use the intelligence that you've gained from other channels and other behaviors and other sort of social mining that goes on, and then use that to insert content into the game. So your character can now drink their favorite brand of drink, and you start to get into some really shady areas of, as you said, brain hacking, because that focus is so immersive, because we can use so many different senses to manipulate and tweak that and create an authenticity to it, even though it may be a completely pure digital asset. And we're in some pretty interesting spaces from, manipulating people at a cognitive level. And I think it's going to be a real challenge for us to control that.
Okay. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Micah.
Sure. Well, I think that, humanity's already been hacking each other's minds and each other's brains. This is already, we don't even realize that we're doing it, but the outside world and our brains are in a feedback loop constantly. So, VR is just we're creating a virtual world, and sure, yeah, we could take brain hacking to the next level, and that's exactly what I'm interested in doing as a researcher, is taking brain hacking to the next level, or neuro hacking. And so I'm excited about the possibility.
Do you think that there's a burden of responsibility here, though, in terms of avoiding biomarketing, if that's what you want to call it, in terms of that, the abuse of knowledge and technology to be able to allow that advertising to happen? It's one thing to do it for research. It's quite another to do it for advertising.
Right. Yeah. It's the possibilities are really scary when it comes to not just that, but there's so many potential. If you can regard the human mind as a special kind of hard drive, as I wrote about in one of my articles, if we can read and write to the human brain as if it was another kind of hard drive, just imagine the kinds of edits that you could make to a human brain. We're not just talking about advertisers, deeply embedding, choosing your product choices and stuff, but basically changing anything about you. So really that, there's a whole next level of security concerns there and ethical concerns to where you want to make sure that people can't hack your brain, and that's going to be I believe that's going to be a real concern going forward, is the amount of reading and writing that can happen to your brain when you have this next level of technology is a huge concern. And so if we had concerns before, they should grow exponentially in terms of the kinds of things that we're thinking about in terms of consumer protections, because I just imagine a world where you can do so much to influence someone now, and influence will be such a powerful thing that we'll have in a computational way that you won't call it influence, you'll call it changing someone's choice for them. It'll go beyond influence. You'll be changing a setting in their brain, basically.
Okay. So
yeah.
I'm kind of curious, and I'm going to throw this one at you, Phil. So if we kind of follow on from where Mike is going with this, and I don't know if you've seen the Netflix show Altered Carbon. Have you been watching that, Phil?
Yes, I have. Yes,
oh,
I have.
Good. I'm not going to babble a load of nonsense at you, and you're like, what's she talking about? But with Altered Carbon, one of the things that I found quite interesting was that there obviously this idea that people can, kind of download their brain onto this little disc thing that's inserted into their spine, and they can take that out and then just insert it into a new body, and the human body literally just becomes the container. They call it the sheath. You can change out bodies as and when you please, and in some ways I find this quite interesting, because one of the things that they explored in the show, and to my mind actually they didn't go quite deep enough with this, because I felt that there was a lot of fascinating exploration that could have been done here, was this idea then that the mind and the body become these two separate entities, and that the body can be utilized as a form of torture, because it's a physical embodiment. You can't escape from the body once the brain has been inserted into the body. And so there are things that can be done to the body to torture the mind. And it's not about the body so much as the mind, because that you can pull your mind out of that body and just put it into a new, fresh body and start all over again as such. And so I'm kind of curious, Phil, from your perspective, when we look at the development of games and we look at the kind of notion that immersive gaming and immersive entertainment is very much about, to some extent, brain hacking and directly changing or reprogramming the way that people think or their personality traits or behaviors, because ultimately that is where we're headed with this. Do you feel that there is an issue at the moment with the types of content that is being developed from an entertainment and a gaming perspective, in as much as I for one, have seen a great deal of content that people are trying to put out there in the world that is either a horror game of some sort or a very violent shooting or war type game? And granted, in the games industry, that's kind of how most games are. That is the key feature of a game, is you either have something scary or you have lots of shooting. It's about that aggression and that need for progression through aggression. But do we feel that there is perhaps a danger that we are actively preparing a generation of gamers in immersive entertainment formats for a new form of PTSD?
There are two things that you're talking about there. You're talking about Vietnam War syndrome.
Yes.
And also the Stanford prison experiment. Mm-hmm. And I think the Stanford prison experiment is probably the more interesting one, which is the one where some people are the prison guards and some people are the prisoners, but they were all equal at the same things, but then perceived operations come into effect. I think some of the things that Mika and Rick were mentioning, the ethical things and things like this. And the idea that an artificial intelligence is going to come on and sort of take over the advertising, we're not going to know. We are not going to be able to see the integral points that this thing is changing our perceptions, because it's very, very the human mind is an incredibly brilliant but incredibly subtle thing, and it's to do with those triggers. I mean, back in the 70s and then all the sort of 70s movies, all this sort of subliminal advertising, subliminal marketing, there was the questions about whether subliminals were used on the troops in the Vietnam War, but there were also things like there's a documentary called Bad Trip to Edgewood, which talks about using LSD on like American servicemen and changing their perceptions and the breakdowns that caused with them. And it's a very, very interesting documentary. For myself as a narrative designer, one of the things I have to do all the time is clear my cache on my computer now, because my computer starts to associate what I'm looking for with things that I will always want to look for. And I can see it in the advertising, although I tend to get lots of chainsaws and things like this, because it's trying to tailor my world to fit me. And I don't want it to tailor my world to fit me. I'd like to see the world with warts and all the problems like going on. So the issue here is, and to take the altered carbon thing, I don't think altered carbon goes far enough. I think altered carbon doesn't even get to the what is human question, and the whole Cartesian like arguments like going on here about like, are we part of the machine or is the machine part of us, and all these types of things. And yes, gaming has always tried to push the boundaries on this, but I think it's up to the communities, and because we were like talking about the communities, again, I think the communities are going to like control a lot of what they see and who they accept in and out of their community. And in a very, very strange way, this sort of becomes community-sponsored anarchy, in the same way that Malafista like talks about anarchy and about creating these village states where everybody in the village agrees with the terms of that village. And I think that's how the gaming communities could go, that you have the broader communities, but within them there are these like small groups who set up the rules for their own communities. It was something that was purported that Second Life might do, but never quite got there, because I don't think the technology was particularly in place. But it's definitely something that now I can see would happen.
Well, you never know. They've got Sansa. It may happen in Sansa. You never know.
Yes.
But Debs, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, when we're talking about the kind of moral and ethical boundaries here, and we talk about this emergence into kind of immersive entertainment experiences, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, from a more traditional games industry perspective, of studios that aren't yet doing VR and may not even be considering doing VR anytime soon. Is there, from your perspective, perhaps a danger that there are too many people who are trying to pivot their studio into VR who perhaps shouldn't be there, or don't have any business really being there? Because you know what, mobile gaming, MMO gaming, console gaming, they're all very different beasts. And studios, tend to be better when they're dedicated to a specific format.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think I maybe misunderstood the question at the beginning about addiction to gaming. I think developers, no matter what you are developing, like, you do have that responsibility to make sure that you're trying to give your players the best experience and hopefully not get them to be addicted. I mean, even if you look at, Tencent, when Honor of Kings came out, they had to limit the amount of hours that kids were playing because it was just too much. So I think, as a developer, like you're not trying to do a disservice to your players. You want them to play your game, but realistically, not to their own detriment, right? Like, games are supposed to be fun and something positive at the end of the day. So,
in an ideal world, yes.
in an ideal world, for sure. But I think as far as specializing or focusing on one particular thing, I mean, for us, definitely mobile is our bread and butter. And I mean, we don't look to try to be something else, because platforms are all very different. And I think once you try to specialize towards different platforms all at the same time, you lose something. So we've learned through developing games here, if we're trying to create an experience on mobile, but we've had an idea that we want to port a certain console game onto that platform, like, you quickly realize that that's not the best way to try to develop a mobile title, because you have to make use of the platform. So, you were talking about earlier, people playing competitive games for 10 to 15 hours. I mean, if you're making a competitive game on mobile, you have to take into account that platform is different, and maybe people want shorter sessions because the way they interact with a mobile device will be different than the way they interact with the PC. So I think making sure that your games fit the platform is really important, just for players to be able to get the most out of them. So I don't think it has to be a one size fits all, you know.
I'm kind of glad that I'm hearing this, and Phil, I want to get your sentiment on it too. But I think one of the things that I see a lot of is a lot of people coming from existing game studios and saying, you know, we're going to pivot, we're going to do VR games as well. And they don't necessarily have the background or the understanding for it. They're just kind of diving in because, well, they're from the games industry, so they must know how to make VR games. And Phil, I'm kind of curious from your perspective whether or not you think perhaps maybe that they should be having a little bit more of a thorough think about that before they dive in.
I think when we did the podcasts about marketing in VR, I think one of the things that I said at the end, one of my points was like, people need to start, if they're going to work in VR, they need to understand what 3D looks like. And I think people have got so used to just looking at their flat screen phones as they wander around this beautiful world, paying no attention to anything else that is going on, and then suddenly getting shocked when it snows. It's much, much more important that if you're going to move into a field, you should really, really try and understand what you hope to achieve in that field. In the VR writers' room, again, we said, why are you doing this in VR? What's the point? What are you hoping to gain here? And what's the value of doing this? I think the value of doing games for me is, and this is actually the talk I'm doing on the weekend, is when you're creating a game, what are you creating it for? Because you can create it for art or you can create it for profit, to be honest. But that does not mean that both of those things can both be fun and also can both be, and the thing can swap. You know, you could create something for art and it makes a profit, or you could try and make something for profit and then it becomes effectively a piece of art. It becomes recognized within the industry. It's a hard thing to do, but you have to understand the market that you're going into and why you're going into this market, and what you hope your players are going to enjoy about it. And interestingly, last night, yet again, I watched the South Park episode Freemium Isn't Free, and it's still so relevant today, especially when I saw a mobile game released for a popular TV franchise, and the game looked like a terrible version of Fallout Shelter and had no relevance to that TV franchise. And you can spot my post about that on Facebook if you can find me. But it's this thing. It's just like, don't make games to fit into the market. Make games that you want to love, because then your community is much more likely to love them too.
So, Rick, I'm going to throw this one at you, because what Phil is saying here is actually extraordinarily common in the advertising world. And certainly back in the day when I worked with advertising agencies, I recall several times, you know, where a brand would come with a specific remit and a brief and say, we want a game. And, you know, it was a box ticking exercise. It wasn't necessarily anything to do with the relevant franchise or the relevant brand or IP. It was just a case of, we want a free runner game and it needs to look a little bit like that other free runner game, but it needs to have our brand on the top of it. Let's make it. And I wonder from, you know what I'm talking about here.
He sighs deeply. The infamous branded game.
I mean, do you see this as something that...
Can we just stop doing that in advertising? Would definitely be my comment on that.
Do you think it's something that you're going to see a lot of VR games emerging, where it's just a case of people pointing at somebody else's game and just going, we want that, let's do that?
Well, we've already seen not so much games so much yet, or I haven't seen any. I've probably been deliberately hiding from them, to be honest. But I think we've certainly seen brand apps in VR. And they're almost as fatal as the microsite advertising strategy.
Back in the day.
Back in the day, where we used to love making them because they were great, because they were an ability for us to express our artistic ability. But did they actually really work has obviously come back to haunt us all. And I think we're seeing that at the moment in the industry, that VR, when brands see VR, they see it as an opportunity to create some kind of app. It's very rarely thought through properly. Certainly, A lot of agencies out there have very little experience in VR, and they have very little understanding of it. And when you sort of look at how agencies, have migrated into digital from traditional print, effectively they've just created a facsimile of print in digital a lot of the time with a bit more movement. We haven't really seen an evolution of a new style of creative that is suitable to digital anyway. And I think that we're going to see agencies and brands trying to shoehorn ideas from a traditional perspective into a VR environment, and they'll just go, well, just throw a bit of 3D at it. And as Phil was talking about there about narrative design, and it's something that I'm very, very passionate about, is narrative design in 3D spaces. And so many of the sort of cues that you need to work with, like sound and all of the other senses that need to be brought into play, understanding things like locomotion, understanding motion, understand how character interaction, if you've got two characters in the scene, how that needs to work. All of those complexities are totally ignored by most brands because they simply don't understand them. And they try to shoehorn what is effectively a TVC or commercial in layman's terms into a 3D format. And I have seen maybe one or two that have done an okay job of it, but I've seen a whole lot of disastrous narrative design that, you would just, anybody even coming from a games experience background where they have at least the understanding of what 3D environments are, would never have made those mistakes. But because they just assume that it's simple to do the translation, it's just a port of something we've done before. That worries me. Games, of course, we see mobile games that are branded mobile games that are in 2D. They are popular. They go in and out of popularity. I think we'll probably see the same effect. I think that will be the next little micro phase that we'll see probably in advertising. We'll see some 3D games. They'll just be off-the-shelf games mechanics with branding shoehorned into it. They won't have any playability, as we all expect. So I'm not too worried about that. I think it will just be a load of dross that we have to put up with that will go by. It's a shame because the money that's obviously spent on these things could obviously be spent on some very, very interesting, and I think it is an incredibly creative space that we could be using for advertising. And obviously when we're talking about earlier on about the immersion and how easy it is to manipulate people's feelings and expression of those feelings, it's an incredibly powerful environment that will be massively probably overlooked by the brand people, unfortunately, which is a good thing if you look at it from a social engineering and sort of perception engineering problems that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah,
that maybe brands will just miss it.
We can hope.
They won't have actually. They won't have figured out that they could do some really, really, really horrendous social engineering here if they wanted to. But
yeah, let's hope that they don't figure that out. But okay,
yeah, hopefully. Oh no, we've just let the cat out of the bag by saying it.
Okay, so as always, we like to ask a big question, and in the context of this conversation, that big question is: what is the one thing that you think needs to change, be that cultural or technological, that is going to just change the perception and attitude of communities around these immersive entertainment formats, be that VR, AR, XR, whatever R's you want to put in front of a letter, whatever that thing is, what do you think needs to change? And I'm going to start with you, Phil.
What's the one thing that needs to change? Well, once the AI gets better, then we won't be able to tell what the change is. Generally, because I've had debates with very, very good AI Twitter bots, and then slowly managed to tweak them off course slowly. And then once you tweak them off course, then as soon as the developers spot it, because you're getting them to say completely the wrong things, then you go off. What does it need? It needs the community to have faith in the product. By faith, I don't mean any type of spiritual faith. I just mean that they actually believe the product is doing the right things. Very, very recently, we've had the whole loot boxes debacle and a bunch of other rebalancing debacles that have come out. And much as the games industry has been very, very good at like knowing how far it can push things, much like the advertising industry, it's pushed things too far on a couple of occasions. And as soon as it oversteps the boundaries so far that people really, really notice and crack back, then it's a case of like starting again and having to get that community to trust you again and trust that you're doing this for altruistic reasons. Because I think the community has understand that for these things to be produced, people have to be paid. They just don't feel that people should be like amassing wads of cash to create entertainment. But unfortunately, that is a sort of problem. And I actually found the Oscars very refreshing this year because a lot of the films felt much lower budget in some ways than a lot of the Oscar blockbusters from the past.
Okay. Mako, what's your view on this?
Well, I'm not sure. Okay, so the question is about gaming communities and evolution of communities, and the single biggest change that needs to occur for these communities to evolve. And the answer could be technological, or it could be functional, and
could be cultural.
It could be cultural. You know, so I mean, yeah. So I mean, in terms of like it's such a broad question, and technological. Like I can think of like for VR, for example, there's a number of different device improvements, and it could be that devices need to become all in one. They need to become mobile. They need to become lightweight. They need to become high resolution. They need to become everything integrated into one thing. They need to have a whole bunch of biosensors, EEG, ECG sensors, the heart rate sensors, the brainwave sensors, the eye tracking, pupil dilation tracking sensors. So these sensors, so you're in a VR world or AR world. It's a single device. It has amazing graphics. You're sending light field over 5G light field graphics, so the very best graphics created by cloud GPUs, and you're immersed in this. You have this world that you can. The other thing that's coming is VR parks. So, you like almost like Westworld. Westworld is a big TV show, but we're seeing now the first VR park in Dubai. And I think we're going to see a lot more of these where you go to this huge place where you can walk around inside VR and basically like have a holodeck experience with like a whole bunch of other people. And you can see the avatars of other people. And, and so I think that the world, may be transformed by these VR parks, which will be everywhere, and they'll be very, very inexpensive, and they'll be great places to walk and do exercise, and whole communities can walk around inside VR and inside these parks. I think this will happen, on the technology side, in terms of like, devices becoming cheaper and smaller, lighter, like so technology improvements will help, consumers to mass adopt. And then once people begin to see, maybe it will take this movie coming out and being a big hit, the one by Steven Spielberg.
You refer to Ready Player One.
Ready Player One, yeah. Maybe the masses will see what VR could be, because a lot of people on TV are still like, yeah, VR is an isolating experience, because they're not imagining Ready Player One. They haven't ever read the book or heard of it. But once they see the movie, they'll be like, oh, VR is not an isolating experience. That's how we can be more connected than ever. So maybe we just need that idea to get across that VR is a way to be more connected with people. It's the opposite of isolating, and maybe that idea will cause a massive change to the communities of gamers, and the gamer communities will consider themselves VR gamer communities after this movie comes out because of that idea. So maybe it's a matter of the idea getting across to people through a movie.
Okay, Debs, have you got some thoughts on this?
I think what Micah said is partially what I agree with. I don't think it's just movies, though. I think gaming in general has to be more accessible for just more communities to get involved. Because I think even right now, a lot of my friends are in gaming and a lot of them are not. But the majority of my friends who are not, they can't relate. They don't know what Twitch is. They just don't understand the appeal of gaming, and they still have kind of a narrow-minded view of what a gamer is. They're like, oh, is it going to be that nerdy person sitting in the corner and typing away or whatever, or sitting in the basement? And that is not what gaming is anymore. And I think like to engage with more communities and different communities, it has to become more accessible, whether that's telling different kinds of stories in our games. I do think it's a bit of a cultural thing, like you were saying, Tanya, as well. Incorporating different people into gaming, because it has been, predominantly male for a long time. Obviously now you're seeing more women in it, which is cool. But I think, the idea that gaming is accessible to everybody, and that everybody can enjoy something in gaming, even if you're not, playing for 10 to 15 hours, like I said. It could be a narrative game. It could be something like Episode. I mean, there's so many different types of games out there, and there's something for everybody. And I think there's a large number of people who don't quite sync up with that yet.
Okay.
So, accessible, for sure.
Okay. Rick, what's your thoughts on this?
I think as we move into a immersive community versus the moment we have a very sort of text-based community where it's all really typing on screens still. And I think as we move in towards more of a virtual community, I think the thing that we need to really change is us as creators. We need to really sort of learn to respect our communities. We have some very powerful tools coming onto the table for perception engineering, and we've talked about all of these things. And I think it's a responsibility for us to make sure that we treat our audiences with a bit of respect. We don't just see them as a cash cow, or worse than that, see them as a bunch of people that we could actually manipulate to do pretty much beck and call. And I know that sounds a little bit, science fiction, but we're not far from it, being capable of doing some of this stuff. And I think we just need to have a little bit of respect for that audience. They are the people that buy our stuff. We shouldn't abuse that, and we should have a little bit of respect for them and not manipulate them. And that's, I think, probably going to be the biggest change.
That would be a pretty big change for a lot of studios.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that doesn't mean that we can't create great content. I think we just need to be aware that we're moving away from a situation where people could disconnect very easily from the experience, and we're creating these immersive experiences where we can do very subtle things to them, to that group of people. And I think we need to just be a little bit cautious about what we do. Just because we can doesn't necessarily mean we should.
You're borrowing one of my lines.
Yeah. We probably had that conversation at some point. But yeah, I think it is the biggest change has got to be respect. We've got to keep evolving. And I think there's a responsibility of people like us to go in there and keep on badgering the people and say, look, be aware. Don't be bad.
Okay.
Be good.
So the closing thought then is with great power comes great responsibility?
Yep, definitely.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us. As always, we like to give our listeners a way to be able to find out a little bit more about you. And we ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. What would that be, Phil?
You can find me on Twitter at Philip G. Harris. That's Philip with one L. Generally, if you add me, I'll add you back if you don't look like a bot. And if you want to discuss anything that I've discussed on this podcast, just send me a direct message when you've been added on, or nudge me there, and I'll definitely talk.
Wonderful, thank you. And Debs?
Sure, you can find me on Twitter. It's at Deb Mensah-Bonsu. That's DEBMENSAHBONSU. It's a bit of a mouthful, but yes, if you'd like to have a conversation with me when I'm more eloquent, that would be awesome. So hit me up on there.
Thank you. And Micah, what about yourself?
Hey, you can find me on Twitter at WorkSalt, WORKSALT, WorkSalt. And also people can follow me on Instagram. I am Micah's son. It's MICAHSUN, MICAHSUN on Instagram.
Wonderful.
And, yeah.
Thank you. And Rick, what about your good self?
You can catch me on Twitter at Rick J. Hartley.
Is that HARTLEY?
That is.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you, and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com